It's a great pleasure to be presenting my research at the Herodotus Helpline, which has been an invaluable community for me to meet the incredible breadth of Herodotian scholarship. I'm very thankful to Tom Harrison and Jan Haywood for providing early career researchers the opportunity to share their research. The topic I'll be discussing, growth and environmental problems in Herodotus, stems from my larger interest in the classical Greek historians' representations of physical environments. In my ongoing dissertation, I examine how ideas about regularity in sacred and depersonalized landscapes impacted history writing as a blurry genre and predisciplinary form of knowledge in classical Greece. In this paper, I will focus on two questions. First, how is growth represented in the histories? That is, in what context does Herodotus present growth positively, negatively, and neutrally? Or as something that requires explanation or something that we can take for granted? I have not come across a compilation of Herodotus references to growth, so I have compiled one, and in the first part of my presentation, I go through some common features I detected there without closely reading the examples. My second question, how is growth connected to environmental problems in the histories? In other words, in what situations does Herodotus present environmental problems experienced by various actors as a result of their growth? To answer this question, I will look closely at three passages. Before dealing with the second question, in Herodotian spirit, I will go into a brief digression, which is not a digression, and discuss how we should be approaching the environment in ancient thought. My discussion of these two questions will suggest that in the interconnected world of Herodotus, ideas about regularity, i.e. growth patterns, and the role of the divine play an important role in passages where Herodotus explicitly connects growth with environmental stress. These observations, I think, have important implications for our understanding of the role of history writing as a moral compass. Growth is one of the fundamental ways in which beings engage with their environments. Cells, when they grow, displace what is around them. At a longer time frame, stars, when they grow, bend space-time. And humans, as a group, reproduce and cover parts of the Earth's surface with their constructions, while particular groups of humans grow into each other's territory, thus displacing one another. It's no wonder that scholars working on Herodotus' assumptions about the natural world or the environment have touched upon, at varying degrees, his views on the territorial growth of empires. It's the works of Mary Zingros, Catherine Clark, Joel Schlosser, whose talk about his book, Herodotus and the Anthropocene, you can find on the YouTube channel of the Helpline, and Clara Bozak-Schroeder, that have encouraged me to think more deeply about how the idea of growth relates to Herodotus' ecological thoughts. I think there is need for more assessments of the correlation between growth and environmental stress in the histories, and I hope that this paper is a step in that direction. So, how does the father of Historiae represent growth? The text of the histories is replete with many examples. In Herodotus, the notion of growth encompasses a multitude of processes and end results, which he refers to in explicit and implicit ways as zero-sum or neutral situations. As we will see, these characteristics of Herodotus' representation of growth equally apply to humans and non-humans. We can detect some of Herodotus' explicit references to growth by looking at instances of specific verbs in the histories. Such verbs include auxano, phyo, antheo, hyperecho, profero, when it means surpass, not propose, and hyperballo, when it means exceed, not postpone. The first thing we realize in these instances is that the historian expresses growth either in a self-referential manner, i.e. in relation to the growing being itself, or in a hetero-referential manner, that is in relation to the growth of other beings, which then creates a scenario in which hetero-referential growth has either zero-sum or neutral implications. I will clarify what I mean by these terms with concrete examples from Herodotus' text. First, an example to neutral self-referential growth. In 158.1, the historian asserts that the Greek population in the distant past grew when other peoples joined them. The Greeks grew from a small group into a multitude. Here, growth is expressed without giving further qualifications, except for indicating that it happened in the distant past. The idea that other groups joined the Greeks, and thus the Greeks grew in this way, implies that other groups might have disappeared as a result, but it is only vaguely implied. In this way, the historian expresses the growth of a population in relation to itself, and not in explicit comparison to another group, as he does when he asserts at the beginning of Book 5 that the Indian population is the largest among humans, and the Thracians are the second largest, with the implicit assumption that the Indians had grown more than the Thracians by Herodotus' time. Here, implicit hetero-referential growth has neutral consequences. That is, the growth of the Indians and that of the Thracians do not create a zero-sum situation in which one occurs to the detriment of the other. Herodotus often specifies an aspect in which the group grew, like population or wealth. For example, at a given time, Naxos surpassed all the islands in its prosperity. Eudaimonie ton neston proefere in 528.1. This also applies to the growth of specific human attitudes, as when the Spartan Arete is greater than other Greek fighters at Plataea in 917.1. This is also true in the hypothetical self-referential growth of hubris, which Herodotus puts into Artabanus' mouth, when the latter criticizes Mardonius' warmongering. Given the historian's allusions to the multiple aspects, the limbs, as it were, of groups, he often creates complex scenarios involving growths. To go back to the example of the Thracians, in 531, since population growth does not equal the growth of political power, we have complex situations in which some aspects or parts of a being grow while its other parts decline, at least in relation to their surroundings. So in the examples you see on the screen, human communities grow in terms of their size, influence, buildings, and finances. Cities and dynasties reach their relative acme before they start declining. And through self-referential and hetero-referential articulations of these movements, Herodotus detects complex relations of growth across space and time. Individual humans too, such as the Thracian courtesan Rhodopis, the Samian tyrant Polycrates, or the Athenian general Miltiades, reach their zenith relative to their own previous and subsequent growth, or in relation to other individuals. In a polemic against the claim that Pharaoh Mycerinus' pyramid was constructed by Rhodopis, Herodotus situates the peak of Rhodopis' career under the reign of Pharaoh Amasis. No suggestion about how her growth relates to others or whether it happened to the detriment of other strong women candidates in Egypt at the time. Presumably, it was a zero-sum competition for political influence at the Egyptian court, but Herodotus does not bother clarifying it. In the cases of Polycrates and Miltiades, on the other hand, he gives the clear impression that their growth was a zero-sum situation that occurs only because they diminished the growth of other individuals. In 339, he details the rise of Polycrates at the expense of friend and foe, while in book 6, passages through 132 to 137, Miltiades' conquests and his rise and fall are explained through his exploitation of Athenian forces for personal motives. These are only some of the examples of individual growth, both self-referential and hetero-referential, that Herodotus presents in zero-sum contexts. In the case of communities, it is mostly in battle narratives that the growth of one group happens at the expense of another, especially through the historian's use of the verb hyperballo, which he frequently uses to express people's inability to defeat the Achaemenid king. Other than the zero-sum examples, we also have various more or less neutral self-referential articulations of growth. For instance, when Cypselus grows up from childhood into adulthood, or the nephews of the Spartan regent Teras. In these cases, Herodotus presumably finds it necessary for the logic of his narrative to indicate their passage into adulthood. At other times, self-referential growth is less neutral. In 3:134-3, at the instigation of Democedes, Atossa convinces Darius to grow his territories by using an argument based on the growth of his body and senses, and how they will decay one day. The observations I have made so far also apply to non-humans. Especially in descriptions of lands and peoples, the historian describes self-referential growth in a neutral manner, as for instance, when he describes the growth of specific plants in Arabia in Book 3. In Herodotus' account, these plants grow in the same sense that Teras' nephews grow, that is, without being in any explicit relation to the growth of other plants, and in neutral terms. On the other hand, although the growth of the lion embryo inside the womb of the lioness is self-referential, it happens at the expense of the growth of the womb, which is supposedly destroyed by the lion cub's claws. A theory that purports to explain why lions can give birth only once. When Asia sprouts man, Anteuses Gartes Azies Andrasi, in 411, Herodotus does not relate the Asian demographic growth to any other continent or land, but this sprout leads Darius' attempt to grow his territories into Europe. In other words, Herodotus discusses self-referential growth in both neutral and negative terms. In hetero-referential non-human growth, we also find neutral and zero-sum situations. One example of neutral growth would be that of the crocodile. In his account of the Egyptian fauna in Book 2, Herodotus reports the extraordinary percentage of enlargement that crocodiles have in comparison to other mortals. At various other passages in the histories, non-humans grows at the expense of other humans or non-humans. A typical example would be the growth of the unbearable Aphoreton storm off of Magnesia at 7188, which occurs to the detriment of Xerxes' soldiers and ships. We can now start seeing, I think, how growth, when narrated as a near zero-sum situation, becomes an environmental problem. I will get to this in a second. But before that, let me just say a few words about limbs in Herodotus. Characteristic growth of plants and body parts of human and non-human animals have an important role in the histories. Hair growth plays a narrative role in some historical accounts. For instance, it's a bad omen when the Pedasan priestess of Athena grows a beard in Book 1. In Book 5, hair growth presumably helps start the Ionian revolt against Persia in the famous account of the man with the tattooed head, by helping hide Histaia's secret message under the cover of his growing hair to Aristagoras. In descriptions of lands and peoples, hair growth is also important. Its color and shape help detect the Apis bull in Book 2. It's not just the appearance of foreign human communities, particularly how specific peoples grow their hair, that interests Herodotus, as in Libyan or Scythian tribes, but also Greeks like the Spartans, which puts growth into the radar of Herodotus' interest in nomoi. Until now, I have been mostly discussing explicit references to growth that I detect through the presence of certain verbs. There are also many implicit cases which would take us weeks to go through. Given the fundamental role of growth in our perception of the world, one could indeed find it lurking behind virtually any passage in the histories. The reference to the existence of something is generally enough to assume that it grew out of something else, provided we do not venture into ex nihilo territories. Yet there are more concrete passages in the histories where, let us say, growth is lurking closer to the surface. Such implicit instances of growth include size measurements, for example, of armies or seas, reproduction, human constructions, and territorial expansion of various polities. When Herodotus designates the shape of beings or their availability in certain places, we can reasonably infer tacit assumptions about past growth or recurrent growth patterns. It's important to keep in mind that Herodotus is not interested in noting every single instance of growth. For instance, he does not note that grains grow in the fields every spring. Instead, he is interested in noting the availability of plants, animal, or limb shapes in particular regions as a way to give geographical descriptions. He is also interested in recording when an army ravages the grains that grew in a place, although we cannot be sure if he is exhausted in documenting that. Or when lack of growth triggers a significant event. For example, the complete lack of produce in Epidaurus in Book 5 results in the introduction of the worship of a deity whose name literally means growth, Auxesia, in 582-83, which then plays an important role in the hostilities between Aegina and Epidaurus. Without going into detail, let us look at two kinds of implicit growth that Herodotus presents as a zero-sum situation. In the imperialist expansion of human groups, that is the well-studied phenomenon of conquest in Herodotus, territorial growth is occasionally presented as targeting the moira, that is the share of another group. For instance, in 182-2, we have the Spartans cutting off Thyrea, the share of Argives, which results in both sides developing specific nomoi for growing their hair. The Spartan-Argive conflict is set within the larger narrative of Croesus expanding into Cappadocia to increase his own moira, and Herodotus tells us about Thyrea when Sardis is besieged by Cyrus, who himself later dies in quest for the moira of the Massagetai to the east of the Caspian Sea. Another example is Xerxes' attempted expansion into Europe in Book 7, where famously the Achaemenid forces not only fight humans, but also land and sea. Indeed, Herodotus stresses multiple times that the Persian growth towards Europe corresponds to the decline in local water resources, as well as the loss of human life and sacred buildings. We also find an example of antithetic growth in his report of the seasonal wars between the Arabian winged snakes and the Egyptian ibis birds in 275. Again, in the famous passage on serpent, rabbits, and lion reproduction in 3:1089, Herodotus clearly discusses the growth of one group of animals at the expense of other groups. Another type of zero-sum growth associated with non-humans is various kinds of landscape transformation. Herodotus uses verbs of growth in describing the seasonal flooding of the Nile or the alluvial formation of the Egyptian soil. On longer time scales, ones that we would call geological, sea and land grow at the expense of each other. In these cases, land seems to grow in size or at least appearance at the cost of water and vice versa. Growth lurks behind human-induced transformations too. There are abundant examples, but suffice it to say that in Book 7, when Xerxes reaches the Hellespont, he increases the amount of land on the Hellespontine waters, and he does the opposite with his canal at Thebes. In general, growth also lurks behind Herodotus' references to magnitude. Thus, as his readers, we can infer it behind significant chunks of text, like the catalogue of Xerxes' army at Doriscos. There's a similar situation in the reference to the megala erga of humans in the proem, and Herodotus' programmatic generalization in 154, where he famously asserts that many of the formerly great things had become small in his time and vice versa, which he glosses with a generalization on the ebb and flow of human fortune, the anthropeian eudaimonia. Coupled with decline, its twin, growth is around the corner in these passages, even when it's not explicitly mentioned. Herodotus does not generalize that every instance of growth is detrimental to surroundings, but already at the beginning of the histories, the moral dilemmas around growth are hinted at. If human settlements that grow eventually decline, What does that tell us about their relations to other settlements and landscape surrounding them? If inevitable, does decline result from the growth of others? I would now like to start connecting growth more clearly with the issue of environmental problems in Herodotus. As I suggested earlier, when Herodotus narrates growth as a zero-sum situation, from the perspective of the losing side, i.e. from the perspective of the beings whose growth is detracted, we have instances of what we would designate as environmental problems. Let me re-emphasize that not every instance of growth happens at the expense of others in Herodotus, but when it does, it corresponds to environmental stress. As in the relationality of growth that I have been emphasizing, there is something relative about environmental problems too. The storm of Magnesia that I have referred to earlier constitutes a problem for Xerxes and the Persian army, but it was a relief for the non-Medizing Greek forces. Herodotus reports the loss of ships, personnel, and cargo, refers to the storm as Aponos, and notes that it was unbearable, aphoreton. But he also records in 7189 how grateful to Boreas, to Thetis, and to Poseidon the Athenians were for this storm. After all, the diminishing of their enemy facilitated their own aggrandizement. This zero-sum game in that passage is a complicated one. It is clear, however, that the growth of winds and rain was also a win for the Athenians. In Book 8, when further Achaemenid ships sink near Euboea, Herodotus again notes that the Persians came to trouble, as Kakaekon, only to note in the famous section of 8:13 that this was an act of God. In Walderfield's translation, this all happened by divine will to reduce the Persians' numerical advantage and bring their forces down to the level of the Greeks. Divine interference through environmental pressures is the trumpet of the elephant in the room that I have been avoiding so far, namely the role of the divine in Herodotus' ecology. But I will come back to that issue a bit later. As a local of Istanbul, within my lifetime, I have witnessed and continue to witness the urban growth and the correlated bridgings of the Bosphorus at the expense of human and non-human dwellers of the region. And the parallel situation in the nearby Dardanelles, both areas where, according to Herodotus, Darius and Xerxes had pontoon bridges built in order to grow their territories and punish their adversaries. Like the often discussed moral implications of bridging in Herodotus, the modern suspension bridges in the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles have prompted discussions about what kinds of growth and developments are preferable. The image on the left of your screen shows Istanbul's urban growth since the 1970s, which supposedly creates the need for bridges to help with transportation, but the bridges themselves, which should be the solutions to a problem, then stimulate even more urban growth and related problems. This image does not even show the last construction boom that happened after the construction of the third bridge in the north of the city. I think these images demonstrate growth as a zero-sum phenomenon. As for Herodotus, he does not explicitly condemn bridging itself, nor does he criticize the growth of human constructions at the expense of other beings, or even the conquest of lands and peoples in itself. Through the mouth of his warners, such as Tomiris, Croesus, Amasis, Nitocris, and Artabanus, and through the way he frames his narrative, he directs our attention to a critique of overgrowth without giving a rule of thumb about when growth becomes overgrowth, or without making it clear when exactly he agrees with such critiques. I will say more about this when I look into Artabanus' warning to Xerxes in the last part of my presentation. These examples indicate that when Herodotus presents growth as a zero-sum situation, moral implications are around the corner. Obviously, it is not just the territorial growth of human communities that can happen at the expense of non-humans. The recent flooding of the Thessalian plain had devastating consequences for the inhabitants and the cultivated plants of the area. The growth of water did not only mean the disruption of land, but also loss of life. From the perspective of the region's inhabitants, this environmental problem resulted from the insufficiency of the Greek government to properly implement the planned infrastructures for flood protection. In addition to Herodotus' report at 7129 that the Thessalian plain used to be a sea, which is a zero-sum situation, like the one created by the mutual rise and decline of soil and water in Egypt that I have mentioned. We also have Darius in 3117, controlling the flow of the rivers into the Horazmian plain, which Marco Ferrario discussed in his talk at the Herodotus Helpline. There too, the question of whether local water resources grow or not has moral implications. When one's growth is another's decline, it becomes difficult for the historian selecting and presenting facts not to get involved in moral questions, whether the historians aim for a moralizing account or not. Let me now sum up my points so far. I have asked how Herodotus represents growth. To answer this question, I have compiled his explicit and implicit references, and the result of my preliminary analysis is what you see on the screen. I would love to hear what you think is missing or flawed in the characterization that I'm making here. I believe the examples I went through show that the historian expresses growth either as self-referential, by which I mean that he presents it in relation to other beings. The historian expresses growth either as self-referential, like when you say that the fluid of an artist was in the 1930s, or as heteroreferential, by which I mean that he presents it in relation to other beings. In both cases, we find him expressing growth as a self-contained or detrimental phenomenon. We can talk about environmental problems in this last category, really. That is, when beings grow at the expense of each other. But should we even be talking about environments in discussing his reference to such problems? Let's look at the example of horn growth. Horn growth. As Rosalind Thomas has demonstrated, the relation between horn growth and weather temperature, as well as questions about animal reproduction, are some of the contemporary debates Herodotus seems to have engaged with. Thomas compared the historians' views to Democritus, Empedocles, and Hippocratic texts. In explanation and confirmation of the Homeric expression horned lambs, Herodotus asserts that horns grow quickly in hot places, whereas in a bitterly cold climate, animals either do not grow horns at all or grow only little stumps. Waterfield justifiably uses the term climate in his translation, which indicates here a long-term pattern in air temperature. But the Greek merely refers to thermoisi takou and iskiroisi psychesi, which are very warm and cold airs and/or places. It would seem obvious that Herodotus is thinking about the environment here and asserting that cold air constitutes an environmental problem for horn growth. But how comparable is the idea of conditions in Herodotus and his contemporaries to our views of the natural world and the environment? After all, the text is only correlating air temperature with horn growth. Obviously, air is something that surrounds the horn, but this connection does not necessarily require general assumptions about environmental impact on organisms. As Rosalind Thomas has observed, if anything, we can talk about continental determinism in the case of Herodotus and not environmental determinism, and he's even suspicious about continents. This would also apply to Cyrus's famous generalization at the very end of the Histories about how soft and harsh lands generate soft and harsh fruits and people. As usual, in the best case scenario, our ethic perspective can meet halfway the emic view of ancients. I do not think, therefore, that it makes sense to give up terms like environment in reference to Herodotus, but we really need to be careful about not retrojecting our assumptions that we associate with the environments. Therefore, I hope you will forgive me for going into a brief theoretical digression about the notions of natural world and environment. I've been thinking about how useful these terms are when we discuss ancient ideas, and I would love to hear your opinions on this issue. In a 2017 book chapter, Arnaud Masset has argued the following, I quote, "Everything that was called cosmos or physis in the 4th century emerged in the middle of the 5th century as the organized whole of individual natures, whose order results from a genetic process that has the power to allocate to each thing its due share of abilities and properties," end of quote. According to Masset, the nature-culture dichotomy, when it appears in Herodotus, is, I quote, a secondary consideration compared to the integrated totality of natures. Human convention, custom, and technique are only one of the influences that can affect the nature of a thing and change it. Just another factor to take into account in the genetic exploitation of all natures. End of quote. The last part of this quote seems plausible to me, namely that human customs are only one of the factors in Herodotus that can affect the nature of a thing. But I am uncertain about the previous part on the integrated totality of natures. Does Herodotus demonstrably have the notion of an integrated totality of natures? Or are we assuming that he would have this notion because we arguably detect it in near contemporary Greek philosophers? I'm not sure if Herodotus' usage of the term physis in itself leads to the conclusion that he possessed a notion of an integrated totality of natures. The term environment is similarly problematic. Arguably, there is no term in classical Greek that directly translates to environment. And Clara Bozak-Schroeder asserts that it is first Diodorus Siculus whose use of the word peristasis, I quote, designates the dynamic material circumstances that condition human life over time, end of quote. Closer to our time, Etienne Benson has recently traced the late 18th century emergence of the concept of environment coupled with the concept of organism. As he puts it, I quote, knowing that the concept of environment was invented and painstakingly put into practice at a particular time and place helps us see that it is neither universal nor timeless, and that it is not our only option for understanding and engaging with our surroundings today. End of quote. For these reasons, we cannot overstate the importance of investigating the emic ideas about how ancient Greeks related humans with their surroundings. We should be wary of projecting into Herodotus' histories our own assumptions about natural laws or environmental conditions. One way to go about this is to pay special attention to how Herodotus uses what William Cronon has called the narrative power to reframe the past so as to include certain events and people, exclude others, and redefine the meaning of landscape accordingly. After all, Herodotus does not give an exhaustive chronological list of everything he saw around him or everything he assumed what other people saw around them. Instead, he selects and presents, presumably not in an entirely arbitrary fashion, but one that displays at least some level of spinning. In the words of Clara Bozak-Schroeder, natural boundaries are made and can be remade by both humans and other beings. This malleability of the world allows Herodotus to moralize humans' interactions with their surroundings in the ways he wants, at least in principle. Note that this is different from saying that the natural world was moral for him in itself. As it has been observed by scholars from Scott Scullion to Tom Harrison, not every human intervention into their surroundings is negative in the histories. Examples abound. Suffice it to remind that Darius' bridging of the Bosphorus does not get the negative treatment from Herodotus as that of Xerxes at the Hellespont. Catherine Clark expresses the interconnectedness of humans with their surroundings in the following way. Man and nature are conceived as a dual medium for expressing imperial dynamis rather than as protagonists pitted against each other. If, then, it is neither nature with capital N as the sum of fixed beings with rules, nor the concept of environment as the total set of external circumstances necessary to the existence of specific organisms, as Benson quotes from Auguste Comte, in which framework might Herodotus have conceptualized humans' interactions with their surroundings? One possible approach, among other alternatives, can be found in Philip Descolas' anthropological theory. According to Descola, humans use four modes to identify with and differentiate themselves from non-humans. He calls these modes animism, totemism, analogism, and naturalism. Do not worry about all the details you see on the screen. Without going into detail about the theoretical intricacies and fine-tunings of Descolas' theory or the anthropological debates it has triggered, I will just make a few points relevant to our understanding of growth and environmental problems in Herodotus. So, if we approach Herodotus' characterization of humans and non-humans in terms of Descolas' theory, we cannot take for granted a separation that assigns consciousness to humans alone. This does not mean that Herodotus and his contemporaries were animists. Rather, the mind-body divide would not be as important to him, is what I'm saying here. Instead of two separate groups distinguished through mental capacity, then, in ancient Greece, beings would be commonly identified and differentiated by means of analogical relations. This situation makes for ambiguity between what we consider nature versus culture, physical versus moral, conscious versus unconscious. Instead of these divides, the hierarchical distinction that the analogist mode of identification emphasizes would be those between the macrocosm and the microcosm. I think that it is also fruitful to bring Descolas' approach in dialogue with the work that has already been done on Herodotus' use of analogy. When concrete actions and objects are indices for something different or more intangible, to quote Rosaria Manson, vertical analogy brings out the similarity of situations on different, so that one becomes a sign for the other. Building on Manson's notion of vertical analogy, Descolas' theory would probably prevent us from equating those different planes of reality as the human world versus others, instead maintaining an entangled totality consisting of initially idiosyncratic individuals. Similarly, when Donald Latiner refers to the correspondence among the subhuman, human, and suprahuman world, or when Aldo Corcella mentions intertwined differences and equivalences in the Herodotean mentality, the role of analogy becomes more clear in the construction of an interconnected world. I find it useful to make a comparison with the naturalist model that modern historians have used to study human-environment interactions in order to see what might have been different in analogism. Don't worry about all the details you see on the screen. I just want to point out that when you look at this model, which has been devised by a Swiss historian to study the Great Famine of 1816, when Mary Shelley wrote the Frankenstein, you will see that the relationship between human culture and the environment is mediated by economic practices. Now, I'm not saying that this model has no use. I just think it's important to ask whether something like this could make sense to Herodotus, and if not, for what specific reasons. I hope it is at least in part clear why I think Descolas' theory is relevant to studying passages in Herodotus that refer to human interactions with their surroundings. Let me reiterate that this Descolas is not the only approach we can adopt when we examine pre-modern ecologies. I would be really curious to hear how you tackle the kind of challenge that I describe here, or whether you think this is a real challenge at all. I now return to the histories, and this time look more closely at some passages that explicitly connect growth with environmental problems. As I said earlier, it's characteristically when Herodotus presents growth as a zero-sum and heteroreferential situation that we can talk about external problems coming from the surroundings. I think three passages are particularly important for understanding the connections he makes between growth and such external pressures. If you think of any other relevant passages, I would love to hear about them. The first passage I will look at is the famous passage on divine providence and animal reproduction in Book 3, which is set within a description of the flora and fauna of Arabia, which Herodotus relates within his account of the Achaemenid realms. Many scholars from Henry Immerwahr through Paul de Man have written about various aspects of this passage, particularly on the role of divine providence and natural order in Herodotus. I will read it and make two observations, building on my discussion up to now. The Arabians also claim that the whole world would be overrun, passa ange epimplato, by these snakes, if they were not liable to something similar to what I know happens to vipers too. Divine providence is wise, as one would expect, and it looks as though it has arranged things so that all timid and edible creatures produce young in large quantities, because otherwise they might be eaten into extinction. Epilipe katestiometer. While all fierce and dangerous creatures produce young in small quantities. Hares, for instance, are hunted by all wild animals and birds of prey, and by man too, and so they are very prolific. Hares are the only creatures that conceive while pregnant. A hare can be carrying fetuses in her womb at various stages of development. But on the other hand, a particularly strong and brave creature like a lioness gives birth only once in a lifetime to a single cub, because she expels her womb along with the cub. The reason for this is that while the cub is in the womb, it begins to move around. And since its claws are far sharper than those of any other animal, it scratches the womb. And eventually, as the cub grows, it rips it to shreds. And until by the time it is due to be born, the womb has been completely destroyed. The same goes for vipers and winged Arabian snakes. If they fulfill their natural potential, eginon to hos effusis autois euparchei, so many would be born that they would make human life impossible. An enbiosima anthropos. As things are, however, when they are mating in couples, and the male is in the middle of emission, the female gets a grip on his neck while he is ejaculating, and hangs on relentlessly until she has beaten right through it. So the male snake dies in the way I have just described, but the female pays for what she has done to the male. Tisin toyende apotinei toy ersei. Because while their offspring are still in the womb, they avenge their father by eating their way through their mother's belly, which is how they make their entry into the world. By contrast, other snakes are not a threat to human life. So they hatch their young out of eggs in large quantities. In any case, there are not as many winged snakes as there appear to be. It is just that they are concentrated in Arabia and nowhere else. Whereas vipers, for instance, can be found in every country in the world. It is tempting to generalize this passage and see other instances of divinely imposed natural order in other passages in Herodotus. One question is how this passage relates to Herodotus' generalization about the fluctuation of human fortunes in 154. How important is divine interference in the emergence? How important is divine interference in the emergence of those fluctuations? I'm not sure. But my first point about this fascinating passage is the following. Herodotus situates the act of consumption as an important aspect of zero-sum growth here. The expression epilipe katestiomena, be eaten into extinction in Waterfield's translation, resonates multiple times later in Xerxes' territorial expansion towards Europe, when his soldiers and animals consume entire water reserves according to Herodotus' narrative. Given that verbal connection, we can observe that beings in their own manners have a drive for maximum growth, expressed with the term physis here, which also translates to cluster of stable characteristics in Gregory Velasco's reading of Herodotus. Xerxes, Mardonius, lions and snakes, but also rabbits. This drive for maximum growth, if unregulated, apparently would lead to the domination of one group over all in a kind of death match. In one example, at least, in 4:105, God does not seem to have interfered. Snakes invade the territory of the Nuri people in Scythia and displace that community, which Herodotus chronologically relates to Darius' Scythian campaign. There, the historian uses the verb ekleipo, which echoes the epileipo in 3:108. Gods also interrupt the growth patterns of animals when they send omens multiple times in Herodotus. Consider Agaristes' dream about giving birth to a mule, which turns out to be Pericles in real life in Book 6. Consider also the account in 757, where a horse gives birth to a rabbit, and then a mule gives birth to a hermaphrodite mule in Sardis. Both examples are easily interpretable bad omens, Herodotus says, against Xerxes' attempted territorial growth. Finally, consider the swarming of snakes in front of Sardis when Cyrus besieges the city in 178. Here, Herodotus uses the verb enepleste, which is verbally echoed in the Epimplato of 3:108. He notes the unusualness of horses eating katestion, snakes in this case, but Croesus delays in understanding why this is a bad omen. My first point, then, is that Herodotus situates consumption as a kind of external stress that is subject to divine interference. My second point, Herodotus also relates punishment and revenge to this cycle of growth versus consumption. Baby snake takes revenge from the mother for what she did to the father snake. The environment thus assumes a personified aspect where beings respond to growth through their emotions. A less explicit example would be how the Hellespontine wind, which I quoted earlier, presumably takes revenge from Xerxes by sinking his ships in Book 7. Of course, this would be in response to Xerxes yoking the strait as his slave and then whipping it, in an example of interpretatio graeca that may derive from interesting practices in actual Near Eastern rituals, which Johannes Halbold and Anka Dan have recently explored from different angles. I think that in such passages, our ideas about natural laws or the nature-culture divide may become obstacles. As Philip Descola emphasizes, the distinction between the macrocosm and the microcosm seem to explain better Herodotus' narrative choices in these passages. To use Rosaria Manson's terminology, Herodotus reports that the concrete object of the storm and destroyed ships were seen as indices for the intangible emotions of the Hellespont. The motive of punishment and revenge brings me to the second passage I would like to focus. Before Xerxes' Greek campaign, Artabanus warns him with an analogy he makes between various overgrown beings. I read from Waterfield's translation. You can see how the god blasts living things that are prominent, and prevents their display of superiority, fantasia style, while small creatures do not irritate him at all. You can see that it is always the largest buildings and the tallest trees on which he hurls his thunderbolts. It's the god's way to curtail anything excessive. And so even a massive army may be destroyed by a small force if it attracts the god's resentment, and he sends panic and thunder until they are shamefully, anaxios, destroyed. This happens because the god does not allow anyone but himself to feel pride. Ugar eai phronein mega oteos allon heuton. Once again, it is tempting to generalize Artabanus' points here and suppose that the view presented here reflects Herodotus' worldview as Merizingros does in her book, Herodotus' Views of Nature. I have my doubts about that, especially about whether we can reduce the multiplicity of perspectives in Herodotus to a moralistic interpretation of history implied by Artabanus. As various scholars have observed, there's an unquestionable correspondence between various points Artabanus makes in his speeches and the way Herodotus frames his narrative of Xerxes' Greek expedition. For example, thunder and fear mentioned in the passage on the screen are echoed multiple times in subsequent narratives, or his warning that Xerxes will be fighting against water and land, confirmed by the Delphic oracle, also proves prophetic. Yet my doubt mostly comes from the fact that Herodotus devotes so much narrative space to the perspectives of Mardonius and the tall man in Xerxes' dream, who instigates his drive for maximum growth. The historian certainly spares abundant room for the moral critique of overgrowth, but his description and explanation for the drive for maximizing growth are also noteworthy, in my opinion. The one point I would like to underline about this passage is that Artabanus' argument is somewhat paradoxical because, like in the example of lion and rabbit reproduction we have examined, hare reproduction we have examined, he does not specify when growth becomes overgrowth. Tall and proud trees and buildings receive thunders, but it is unclear how tall you need to be to trigger divine envy. In other words, Artabanus is already talking to somebody whose empire controls massive amounts of territories. Why it was not overgrowth before, and suddenly now it becomes problematic is unclear. And this is kind of also the point that Xerxes' dream makes. The emphatic point is that the drive for maximum growth is only acceptable when it belongs to the macrocosm. In a sense, then, in Herodotus, Artabanus is not really representing a critique of overgrowth per se, something similar to the modern degrowth movements, but rather the counterpart of the drive for maximum growth that presumably exists in humans and perhaps other beings. We have a similar situation in Thrasybulus' recommendation to Periander in 529 F2, which is verbally echoed in the Artabanus passage through the repetition of the words kolou and hyperechonta. There, the tyrant is recommended to bring low or cut short the overgrowing citizens, just like he does with the ears of grains. Again, to use Manson's terminology, in Artabanus' analogy, the concrete actions of thunder destroying trees, buildings, and the hypothetical observation about soldiers' fears and diseased large animals are presented in this passage as indices for the intangible emotions of God. A nature-culture dichotomy based on conscious minds versus unconscious bodies would have difficulty explaining what Herodotus is doing with this analogy. A bit later in the Persian debate about whether to grow their empire into Europe and punish the disobedient Greeks, Artabanus uses a sort of ship of state analogy. So he says to Xerxes, "In my opinion, my lord, it's all the same whether one has good ideas oneself or is prepared to listen to someone else who is offering good advice. Though you have both of these qualities, you keep company with bad men, and that leads you astray." This is like what they say about the sea. In itself, there is nothing more useful for the human race, but the winds that lash it refuse to let it be itself. In this analogy, we do not have any direct reference to the hierarchy between the microcosm and the macrocosm, as we did in the two previous passages. But like the previous two, this analogy seems to position the tangible storm and the calm sea next to the conscious human decision-making, which is intangible. I'm particularly interested in Herodotus' use of the term physis in this passage. Powell's lexicon to Herodotus gives nature for this specific passage. But due to the ambiguities of that term, I'm not sure what to make of the expression to use one's own nature. Waterfield's rendering as "let the sea be itself" makes a more clear distinction between one's unchanging nature, in a sense that would be implied by the notions of natural law and essence, and a flexible sense of character, which realizes itself in varying degrees. Their physes set limits to what can happen, in varying degrees. As Gregory Vlassos puts it, barring supernatural intervention, whenever things interact, their physes set limits to what can happen in Herodotus. In this sense, Artabanus seems to be setting a limit to Xerxes' growth by saying, "It isn't like you to listen to bad advice and overspill like the sea." In the animal reproduction passage we just looked at, it was God who interfered with the physis of beings. In Artabanus' first analogy, it is again God who oppresses microcosmic beings to stay where they are. In this passage, however, the external pressure on the sea and the ruler comes from bad advisors and the growth of winds. Herodotus apparently connects growth and environmental problems through the notion of physis. There is an interesting semantic overlap that I think allows him to express that connection in this way. In Massey's words, the process can be converted into structure and the structure into process. The shape of the tree can be thought of as the result of a process, and its action of growing is something that is constantly illustrated by its form. This set can be called scheme of plant growth if we assimilate hair and fur to leaves, or simply schema of growth. End of quote. This makes a lot of sense, especially when we think that almost every time Herodotus uses the terms physis or phyo, his subsequent account will include a description of the size, place, and shape of beings. Consider how he uses physis in application to the patterns of seasonally fluctuating water levels of the Nile and the Danube. In Herodotus, then, growth patterns of beings seem connected to whether they are causing environmental problems. Finally, this observation would also suggest that the position, the size, and the appearance of beings play an important role in how they interact with their surroundings and the kind of external pressure they may trigger. As a result, in Herodotus, the position of beings, when not generally understood in quantitative terms like we do today, can be endowed with meaning. By that, I mean today we understand space and time as in coordinates. and not necessarily inherently endowed with meaning. Sometimes. For example, the position of lions, like their reproduction patterns, is limited by the rivers Achelous and Nessus, which is comparable to the spatial allotments of human communities at given points. In the way Herodotus presents, the Xerxes' desire to control everything under the sun and punish anything that protrudes is to play God, in terms of its aim to control the growth patterns of other mortal beings. This seems to fit well Descola's following observation. In analogism, space is more than, I quote, an extension resulting from the juxtaposition of homogeneous parts, but a collective of concrete sites that serve to classify beings and things from the point of view of action. Every existing being must occupy a place appropriate to its identity in both physical space and social space. End of quote. So where does all that leave us? To my first question, I have given the provisional answer that Herodotus represents growth as zero-sum or neutral processes and end results, and that heteroreferential zero-sum growth corresponds to environmental problems. Concerning the theoretical challenges associated with the terms nature and environment, I have commented that we need to be careful about ancient Greek ideas of regularity in the world and the kind of interactions ancient Greeks imagined between humans and their surroundings. Finally, to my question, how does Herodotus connect growth with environmental problems? I have observed that ideas about regularity, i.e. growth patterns, and the role of the divine play an important role in passages where Herodotus explicitly connects growth with environmental stress. I have also noted that the dialogic or the polyvocal elements in Herodotus' narrative are probably not reducible to an overarching critique of the drive for maximizing growth. I hope that I have at least been able to show that growth is a useful notion to think about Herodotus' representation of the environments. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and questions.